I have some more thank yous too. I'd like to thank Susan Hendrick and Danette Kellogg at the library for hosting us here. I'd like to thank the Arts and Culture Commission for giving us your seal of approval, and the City Council, and for our operating support grant. And that's been huge help to us. Many of our sponsors are here. Dr. Niemer and Dr. Lee, who sponsor the children's concert at the library, and Norma Denlinger, who has sponsored Greg, but she could not be here tonight. So we'd like to thank her too in absentia. Greg, I've known Greg for like 20 years. Most of it online through the Prodigy, if you remember Prodigy, online bulletin boards, the classical music bulletin board, and he was on there. And Martin Bookspan was one of our moderators. And 15 years ago, when I was at a workshop at Carnegie Hall, and I was able to, I was treated to dinner by Mr. Sandow and Arnold Huberman, who was, at age 19, I believe he was the youngest percussion member ever of the Boston Pops. And this was many years later.
He started the A&E network.
Yes, right. He started the A&E network. So I went out and we went at this big fancy bar in New York City. And of course, I don't drink. And so I embarrassed them both. And they'll never forget me because I went up and I asked for root beer. But I've had the pleasure of knowing Greg for many years, and now we're Facebook friends, like many of you are. And he's a composer. He's written 4 operas. He's currently writing some other things, and he's going to be having a concert, all of his music, in Washington, D.C. in about a year and a half. And he's just a delightful man. You're going to really enjoy him. He is an arts blogger. He writes for blogs. He used to be the arts music critic for the Wall Street Journal. His wife, you may know Ann Midgett as the chief classical music critic of the Washington Post, and they have this adorable little 2-year-old named Rafa, and he's almost as cute as our grandchildren. So,
but not quite.
Not quite. And so, Greg, would you please come share your words of wisdom for us? Thank you.
You know, it is such a pleasure to be here. Tom, that's the best introduction I've ever had. Next to Tracy's. Because I'm not fancy in your eyes. I don't have whatever credentials I may supposedly have. I'm somebody who does something that's probably pretty interesting and substantial, and I'm a great guy. I like that so much better. And you know, I'm a big city guy. I'm from New York. I travel there every week to teach, live in Washington, D.C. It is such a pleasure to go other places where, I don't know, you don't want to stereotype anything, but there's a kind of reality. I know this also because we have a country house in a very small town outside New York City, and you deal with the post office there. God, is it a pleasure. You know, they just want to help you. So I have had a wonderful time being here these last many minutes since Tracy picked me up at the airport and brought me here, talking to so many of you. Tom and Julie impressed me no end with what they told me about their theater company, and just beginning to get an idea of what happens here. I always say this, and it may sound like silver-tongued, ingratiating myself with you, or whatever, but I learn so much when I travel. My second trip to the Midwest, by the way, I was in Greencastle, Indiana at DePaul University last week, here now. And before I go on to the substance of my talk, a word about root beer. Okay, Arnie and I, urban sophisticates, Tracy would probably not call herself that. And here we are in a bar which is really fancy, really trendy, and has body parts on the wall. Noses, whatever. You know, sculptures. So,
There we go.
it just won't stay. Now, okay, now probably. Okay, so she orders root beer. Arnie and I were not embarrassed. Arnie and I are gallant gentlemen, and our point of view was the lady wants root beer, the lady better get root beer. And the bar provided it. So let's hear it for the bar whose name I cannot remember. What I do, I should probably say that, is I am a specialist in the future of classical music, which is kind of a weird, ephemeral occupation, except that the field is in trouble in many ways. The audience has been aging for 50 years. I'm not going to give you a whole litany about this, but just so you know, the audience has been aging for 50 years. It has been shrinking. Funding is now a problem. I know symphony orchestras have had a 50% fall in recent years in the amount of corporate support they get. Many foundations won't touch them because they think they're not solving their problems. Anyway, complicated thing, and obviously classical music is less part of our culture now than it would have been 1950s when it was on network TV with commercial sponsors. And so what do we do about that? Well, actually the field is changing tremendously, and musicians, especially younger ones, are doing all kinds of things to make the music really exciting and more accessible and more part of our world without making it dumb, which I guess I could talk about endlessly, but I wanted to talk about the state of the arts in general, because that obviously is part of the whole story of where classical music is now. So there is a standard kind of talk that I have seen and read given about the arts, which is cheerleading. And there's definitely a place for that. You talk great passion about the value of the arts. You bemoan the state of popular culture, which is, as some people might think, swamping the arts. You say that popular culture is cheap, shallow, ugly, commercial, exists only to make money, manufactured by crass commercial interests. As a dear friend of mine who holds these views was saying to me 2 days ago, there's no love of beauty in our culture. There's no discussion of serious spiritual issues, no thought, no peace and quiet, no ability to reflect. Nobody thinks anymore. When he said that there was no discussion of spiritual issues, I couldn't help saying, oh, so I must be mistaken when I think that there's a huge debate between atheists and religious people, which leads to best-selling books on both sides. But, you know, I had to say that. Anyway, I've heard and read disquisitions like this many times, and I am not going to give that speech. In a way, I'm going to give its photographic negative, except I am going to assert the value of the arts. I definitely will do that. And, you know, I don't know you all, so maybe you will think that what I say is complete and utter heresy, or maybe you'll feel I gave you something to think about, or maybe, for all I know, you're right with me in everything I say, and you're going to wonder why I bothered to take your time to say it to you since you already think it. I have no idea. But one more thing to set the stage really for the way I want to end, but where I think the discussion really belongs. When we talk about the place of the arts and art in our society, we are ultimately not just talking about art and the arts. We're talking about people. People who, if they are not arts people, may be different from us. So we're talking about how much sympathy we might have for them, how much compassion we can have for other human beings, what kind of human dignity we can allow them, and especially since this seems to be an age where the arts feel a little bit threatened and need to advocate for themselves, I feel it's so important to know the people that we want to advocate to value them, to care about them, and to value what they think about and what they care about, partly because what a strategic mistake if we don't. How are we going to talk to them effectively if we don't know who they are and we don't show some respect for them? But also I think it's a human failing, and ultimately that's actually more important to me than artistic matters, we would sell them short as human beings if, because we are in the arts and they are not, we thought we knew more than they did. We would be treating them unfairly. And because relationships always go two ways, we'd be losing a chance to learn from them. So that's the end of my prelude. I feel there's never really been a better time for art. Maybe not the arts, but for art. Because art is being created all over our society in all kinds of interesting, spontaneous ways. I don't know how many of you have watched Project Runway and all the seasons it's been on TV, but the stuff those fashion designers do who are competing for big prizes is often really extraordinary. And they talk overtly about art. They talk about the need to make it commercial, it has to sell, but they also want it to be art. So that would be one small example I might give. And so many people are interested in creating fashion. The arts are troubled because, as formally defined, theater, poetry, classical music, painting, whatever, dance, floating in a sea of popular culture that obviously gets more attention. And there are questions of, is there enough funding? Does the society regard us as legitimate enough? And how do we advocate for ourselves? So I have to admit that I have problems with a lot of the standard arts advocacy. I will probably talk too much about music because it's my field. So those of you who are not in music, I apologize to you, and you can probably teach me a lot about things I might have said about your areas. But in classical music, the great hope of so many people to restore the classical music audience to the size it used to have, and the music to the centrality it once had in our culture, is music education. I mean, obviously in past generations, people learned about classical music in school, and we have to do that again. Now, one problem with that is, does learning about it in school make you love it? I've seen a survey in a book published in 1940, people go to orchestra concerts. What made you want to go to an orchestra concert? Well, 3% answered music appreciation classes in school. The largest answer was hearing it on the radio. It was all over the radio. And I might maintain that the reason for the music education was because of the popularity of the music, and that the causality did not go the other way. But anyway, if you look at our society and the shortage of funds that we have, can anybody seriously think that we are going to get classical music taught in every school in America? Where's the money for that going to come from? Where is the political will to make it happen? Especially if we define the problem in the first place as not enough interest in classical music or not enough respect for it. And finally, how can we say that classical music has to be the music that is privileged to be taught? We are a great country with a great and diverse history, and we have produced some fabulous music that's not classical. In fact, many people might say that the true American music is jazz, blues, rock and roll, Broadway musicals. That's probably the music most people identify with America. And are we to say classical music is more important, especially dangerous, I must say? I guess that's a strong word, but I will stick with it. When we know that the U.S. is evolving into a country with a non-white majority. So are we really going to insist that we go to the schools and we teach a form of music that is identified with white European culture, and that this gets taught above anything else? It seems to me impossible politically in the longer run, and also just wrong. Gives a wrong impression of the world. I get a lot of email out of the blue from people interested in what I write in my blog and elsewhere. And this woman is a passionate advocate for students learning classical music and has done wonderful work wherever she is, I forgot, starting string orchestras. She says with scorn, and in the public school system in my town, they teach the history of rock and roll. Shallow junk, they should be teaching Beethoven. And I'm thinking, the history of rock and roll is the social history of America from the 50s on. And it is profound, the stuff that comes out. about race relations, for one thing. I could go on about this because it's something I love, but I'll just give you one example. And it's not from a history book. It's a friend of mine who's my age. She grew up in the South. She turned on the radio one day, and she heard a singer who turned out to be Elvis, but he wasn't known at the time. And she said, I cannot tell if that man is black and white, black or white. And in the segregated South, that was a shock. It was like walls crumbled in her mind just from hearing that. So you actually get a lot from teaching the history of rock and roll, and then there's a lot of music as well. Another aspect of arts advocacy that I think is tricky is talking about the economic benefits of the arts. And I know people love to do this. And, you know, there may be something to it, that if you have arts institutions, whether they be in New York or Dubuque or in smaller places, they bring some business to the towns or to the downtown neighborhoods where they happen to be or wherever they happen to be. I'm sure that's true. A problem for that is the more you stress that, the less you're stressing what I think are the core values that the arts are really about, which is internal stuff, artistic stuff. You're also opening yourself to something that could be devastating. Somebody else comes along and says, oh, see, my activity puts more into the community. Kids get higher test scores, more money comes into downtown, so please invest in me, not in the arts. And suddenly you are a little crippled. Finally, it's an insight I got procrastinating one day and reading endless comments in the Syracuse, New York newspaper to a story about the Syracuse Symphony needing $400,000 by the end of the month to stay in business. Spoiler alert, they went out of business the next month. Anyway, the comments in the newspapers were scathing. Just who are they to think they deserve this kind of support? And when people involved in the symphony made the economic argument, we bring X million dollars a year into downtown, the commenters said, if they are that valuable economically to our city, why are they struggling for money? Now, that may make no sense as economics, but it makes a lot of intuitive sense to people. And I think that argument, it may fly with politicians and business people, it may not fly with a lot of people in the public. Finally, a lot of arts advocacy takes what I think is a partial view of the world we live in. And I'm going to cite now a speech by a very well-known arts advocate, and because I don't want to pick fights, I won't mention his name, but he does a lot of the kind of speech I said I would not give, and he does it brilliantly, I really must say. And in one of them that got a lot of play on the internet, he said something I really loved, that the arts functioned as, for us as a nation, for us as a culture, are family photographs. It's really a lovely concept. I warmed to that immediately. So he gives examples. I'm quoting now. As a man whose ancestors come from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, the plays of Beckett, the plays of Shakespeare, the plays of Goethe, these are my family photographs. As a man born and raised in the southern part of the United States, the plays of Tennessee Williams, the stories of Carson McCulloch, the novels of William Faulkner are my family photographs. At which point I say, and forgive me, is this just me? I said, hey, for some people growing up in the South, it was the Allman Brothers. And I learned from Tom Kane that Greg Allman is performing here tonight. So I feel it's exactly the thing I should be saying. And how about the blues? How about country music? These are the family photographs for countless people. And if you're going to talk about the blues, these were family photographs, so to speak, from a disenfranchised people who did not have cameras, and did not have a place where their story would be told in public. Of course, I mean African Americans. And they had this music, which is great music and is immortal. And I just don't see how, if you want to define our family photographs or our cultural heritage, you can leave things out. I'll give you an example to show how deep it goes. My wife and I, flying to see her family in New Mexico, found ourselves missing a connection because of a storm, and instead of flying from Dallas to Roswell, New Mexico, we had to fly to El Paso, stay overnight in a hotel, and rent a car and drive to. So, whatever. We did it. They had satellite radio. I'd never had satellite radio at my disposal. I'm flipping through the opportunities, the 50s rock station. Okay, I grew up on that. My family photographs are doo-wop. First girl I ever kissed was to the Penguins' Earth Angel. I'll never forget that. So I wanted to hear their 50s rock channel, and I thought I was going to hear all the standard songs everybody knows. But no, they were going through Louisiana, town by town by town, and playing the rockabilly songs that had been recorded there, and tracking the development of style from one town to another. I thought this is actually a very deep history, which is part of our family photographs. So am I then saying that the blues, Beethoven, Richard Rodgers, again sticking, and I apologize, to music, are these all of equal value? Actually, that's a large discussion. We're all going to have our preferences of what we particularly like. My only suggestion would be not to try to decide it globally and say X genre is intrinsically better than Y genre. Although I must say, I had a Chinese cookbook that said unequivocally that Chinese desserts were awful. So maybe you sometimes can do that. But I would say it's really better to make value comparisons first within genres, to say, okay, there's great blues songs, and by the way, there are terrible ones, and there are great classical pieces, and there are terrible ones, except we don't hear the terrible ones from the past because they dropped out of the repertoire. But if you delve back, you can hear some pretty weak music. So what we need to do in the arts, I feel, is come to terms with the world around us and its culture, which means popular culture. There happens to be a book on, probably more than one book, but one that got a lot of attention by a man named Stephen Johnson, ironically titled Everything Bad is Good for You. It's about the value of popular culture. And I remember he spent a lot of time diagramming the plots in TV series episodes, showing how much more complex they had gotten over the decades. And if you watch series like The Wire or Lost, which I was never a particular fan of, but whatever, you really see how true that is. And sometimes an episode is completely incomprehensible if you didn't watch many of the previous ones. But I'm going to use musical examples to talk about coming to terms with popular culture. And I'm just going to give examples of people who did it. And Tracy, I'm going to start with you because you are a champion in Facebook. Your posts are so fabulous. I love them. And recently, you remember I liked one where you said that you had resisted liking Christian rock, but finally heard some songs you liked. And then you got into an argument with the song because you didn't like its theology. I have to say, I'm not a Christian, but I agree with you completely. I think you nailed them, but I also think you would become a rock critic because rock critics are forever engaging with the substance and meaning and value of the stuff that they are talking about. Okay, that's an example. Scott Turow, the best-selling author, was a feature in the New York Times book review. They interview a writer and ask various provocative questions. So they asked him, what was the last truly great book you read? And he answers, when I noticed that Patti Smith's Just Kids had won the National Book Award for nonfiction in 2010, I ranted about contemporary culture so celebrity-besotted that we were now giving vaunted literary prizes to rock stars. Then I read the book. It is profound and unique, a perfectly wrought account of what it means to give your life to art and to another person. I expect it to be read with wonder for a long time. Okay, a friend of mine, world-famous concert pianist, I am not going to say who she is. She and her husband and their young son are family friends of my wife's and mine, and our young sons, our 2-year-old. Last time we saw them, she and her husband said, you remember, Greg, and I had forgotten this completely, you told us pop music actually was good. Well, you know, our son studies the guitar now, and he had to learn a song by Led Zeppelin, and so we listened to it. It's really great. I was hanging out at a conference with musicians from the Orchestra of St. Luke's, a kind of boutique orchestra in New York, musician-run, tremendously successful, and artistically superb organization. They had done a gig with, oh man, how can I be having a senior moment with one of the most famous rock stars? Piano player, not Billy Joel, British, Elton John. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. They did a gig with Elton John, and they were just falling over themselves to explain to me what a great musician he was, which they hadn't expected. I can go on with this a long time, but I'll just give one more example. An internet friend of mine named Catherine Shefsky, who teaches piano in rural Pennsylvania, who noticed that her piano students were sort of forced to study classical piano mostly by their parents and played like robots. And she hated this, but didn't quite know what to do about it. She comes home one day and she sees her son seated at the computer with his friends that are all in a band together. And they've recorded a song and now they're editing the song. And she looks at them and she says, they're having a really great time. They're being totally creative. They're completely into this, and nobody's making them do it. And how can I impart this to my students? So she developed a way of teaching where the student is encouraged, what music do you like? Well, let's play it. Oh, I couldn't play that, says the student, having named. Who knows what it might be, a movie theme, a Justin Bieber song, a Rolling Stones song, a classical piece. And she'll say, we'll find a way. And a little bit of that, and they're really willing to study any music because their musical curiosity and creativity has been awakened. So I could say a lot about how pop music, again, my music emphasis, forgive me, works differently from classical music. People say, oh, listen, the harmony is rudimentary, there's no counterpoint. And here's a quote from a rock critic, the late Robert Palmer, who wrote for the New York Times for a long time and is a really deep expert on American roots music, particularly the blues. He says, if you want to hear primitive music, listen to Mozart. And he knew he was being provocative. I knew the guy. Because if you hear Mozart, there's almost no rhythmic variation in it. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 forever. No cross rhythms or polyrhythms to speak of. The way the music's interpreted, all of the tonal qualities of the instruments tend to be very clean and pristine. There's no kind of textural variety like you would get in the blues in terms of roughening the texture out on certain words, playing around with the pitch on certain words, nothing like that in Mozart. Now, Mozart has other virtues, but the point is that different genres of music may work in different ways, and the things that give, in this example, the blues profundity, are things that would be kind of dismissed as performance details in classical music, whereas the one actually gives that music its depth and makes one blues song quite radically different from another. I would just add this, that years ago I was a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota, and I proposed to teach a course called American Music since 1945 when I was going to teach everything. What a joke. I couldn't teach everything, and I didn't teach country music or Latin music, for example, but I did teach pop, jazz, and classical. And the faculty objected to my putting James Brown on it, but he was the one musician the students could not figure out what to say about. These are graduate students in musicology, for God's sake. And the reason they couldn't is if you want to analyze musically what James Brown is doing when he sings, since the chords are not changing, you really want to watch what his voice does with the beat, how he's ahead of the beat, behind the beat, upside down with the beat, and all very knowingly on some partly conscious, partly not level. But they didn't think to listen to that. I'm not blaming them, but just an example of what's there. So as I reach my end, the thing that we have to understand in the arts is that art is taking place everywhere, and not only in the arts. Probably when I was growing up in the 1950s, the understanding would be that it was mostly in the arts. That's where you found art. Now, I don't think we can look at that. There's a book called Engaging Art, which tries to grapple with the position of the arts in society now, and there's a chapter in it about the art that teenagers make for themselves, and it really is a mind blower. The authors talk about kids who are inspired by Japanese anime, Japanese comic books, And so they make their own clothes in anime style and wear a different outfit to school every week, and they learn Japanese. Now, this is not my mother's conception of art, wouldn't have been my conception of art, but that they're doing something artistic is really hard to deny. Or when it was the 30th anniversary of Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run album, a little CD and DVD box set came out commemorating it, and there was a DVD about the making of the album. And at one point, Clarence Clemens, the late Clarence Clemens, the sax player in the E Street Band, Bruce's band, he talks about how he recorded a solo on one of the songs, and I'm ashamed to say I don't remember currently which one. But he said that he recorded many, many, many takes, and that as he recorded each new one, Springsteen had on the mixing board all of them there. And Springsteen, for each couple of measures of the solo, would cue up the part in the previous takes he had liked the best, as if to say, okay, this is what you did, that's great, now do even better. And Clemens said it was the most rigorous artistic experience he had ever had. It's not the kind of experience that we have in classical music, because we do things differently, which is no reflection on us. Not to say we're bad, but just to understand the amount of art involved in what Springsteen does, and understand that somebody who is a working class guy from New Jersey and does not speak in a cultured manner and did not go to college and doesn't know much about contemporary, about official art, can be an artist, although under the influence of his manager, there was a time when he started reading serious books, because he is a very smart guy, and began to understand what kind of league he was playing in, at least in his own mind, as an artist. So how do we do this? In a way, it's very obvious, because it's happening in many fields of art. And again, I feel I'm going to name museums, but I'm very music-oriented. The Metropolitan Museum recently had a show of punk fashion. It featured stuff that the original punks wore, and then the stuff fashion designers have been designing in its image. It's a show that got a lot of attention. Museum of Modern Art has had a whole series on the relations of the art world and pop music, and they had something about what was happening in the 80s when I was a critic covering new classical music in New York, and there was this collision between new classical music, the visual arts world, and pop music, which led to classical composers forming bands. They played really complex music with a rock and roll beat with famous visual artists in the bands. So I was thrilled to go to this museum, because it was like my family photographs. But they did that. And then I remember a play I enjoyed very much on Broadway by Tom Stoppard called Rock and Roll, which was really about Czech dissidents under Soviet rule and their conflict with a die-hard old communist in Britain who just didn't understand them at all. And their flag of liberation was American rock and roll. And the whole play was steeped in that. And then in classical music, there are untold ways in which these things come together. So many young composers write in a style that incorporates as much pop music as it does classical in its very sound, in the fact that it may use a drum kit. There's a young composer, Mason Bates. He can't be so young anymore. He's in my Juilliard class, but now he's got to be 40. But anyway, he's a dance DJ, and he writes pieces for orchestra in which he is a turntable soloist. And they get played by serious orchestras. He was, in fact, composer in residence with the Chicago Symphony. So to end, going back to the human issues I think are at stake, I want to talk about a book by a rock critic named Carl Wilson. And no, he's not the Carl Wilson who was in the Beach Boys. He's, in fact, Canadian. Some people would say as far from the beach as you can get. And he wrote a book about Celine Dion, whom he hated. Rock critics always hate Celine Dion. They think her music is cheap, sentimental, and commercial and manufactured for commercial purposes. The very criticisms people make of all pop culture that rock critics are very quick to make. But Carl Wilson, uniquely among rock critics in my experience, thought he would actually explore this and learn as much as he could about her, about the process of making and selling her records, and above all about her fans. And he really, I think that the book is a great act of charity, actually, and he really changed his mind. Not completely. He found sentimentality to be the core of what she did, but he began to find value in it, and he began to see how it affirmed important values in the lives of her fans. And one of the conclusions he came to was that the knee-jerk opposition to everything she did was actually cutting him off from fellow human beings, and that in the name of high artistic values, he was kind of trashing everything that they believed in and everything that had value to them, which is not, I would say, the way anybody should want to be. So I think our question in the arts, as we stand next to popular culture or inside popular culture and stand alongside all the mess of contending things going on in artistic and commercial culture, which blend into each other so much it's often hard to tell them apart, even in the visual arts world, maybe I could say especially in the visual arts world, where so much is buying and selling. A big part of the question is not just what kind of art do we like, but what kind of people do we want to be? And what kind of relationship do we want to have with our fellow human beings? Once we straighten that out, the incredible value of what we do, which I see that I haven't even stated. I'll just state it briefly, then I'll stop. I'm often asked, what's the value of classical music and how do you even define it? And for me, one of the main things about classical music, two things. It's the historical music of Western culture. It's very important since that's a big part of our cultural heritage, not anymore the only part, but a huge part. And to just trash that and to forget that and have people not paying attention to it is horrible. Plus the fact that the music just sounds fabulous and goes very deep artistically. And then finally, it's music that's written down in advance most of the time and played from a composer's score. And that gives it the ability to unfold over long spans of time the way everybody understands that a novel does and a film does. And it seems to me such a tragedy that the ability to hear that is being lost in our culture, that we have graduate students in English literature who can probably, well, I'm exaggerating, but recite Finnegan's Wake by heart and tell you what every passage in it means. And, they wouldn't know Beethoven or Mahler, or Pierre Boulez or Bartók if they tripped over him. And there's just something wrong with that because they certainly know painting, for example. So our job as arts advocates is just to get out there and make our stuff real and be as human as everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I would like to invite all of you, if you would like, at 7 o'clock upstairs in the auditorium, we're having a focus group for NISOM. We've been doing some long-range planning, and we would love to get your input, and Greg will be leading that from about 7 till 8. And you may stay as long as the food holds out, and please help yourself. But before, as we are saying goodbye, as I said when I opened here, that the Dubuque Cultural Alliance started doing these several years ago, and it's so great to see all of you, but I must say there's one face that I'm missing tonight, and that's Dave Rusk. And I think Julian's journal has gone on great, but Dave was such an integral part of getting the Cultural Alliance going, along with Ruth Nash, and he is missed. I'd also like to bid a fond farewell of sorts to Jan Stoffel. As you know, she's retiring November 1st, and please join me in thanking her for all she's done. The Cultural Cultural Alliance was started by Ruth Nash, as you know, because one of her main goals was to get the arts together to do things for the city and have an impact. And Ruth wanted a seat in City Hall. And Jan has been our seat in City Hall, and thank you so much. Thank you again for coming. Please stay as long as you'd like, until Susan throws us out. And join us for the focus group upstairs if you're able to. Thank you again.